Good morning. 3 minutes after 10 is the time. Rick's been in touch. I like this. Early doors now. It's becoming a bit of a tradition, an amusing text. He says, I live in Romania. Which means that you needed to have heard the little bit that I do at the end of Nick's show, where I pointed out that you don't have to imagine living in a country with a government so corrupted and a media so complicit that enormous or at least significant increases to the cost of your food and significant decreases in the variety and choice of food available to you are now being ushered in entirely as a consequence of a democratic vote back in 2016. But you could, of course, be forgiven for not knowing that it was happening. We've got it in our news bulletins, don't get me wrong, but I'm looking at all the newspapers and, dare I say, some radio presenters even who encourage you to vote to leave the European Union, who will be disarmingly silent on the latest unavoidable proof that it was one of the stupidest things any population in history has ever done to itself. But how annoyed are you with that analysis, right? If you knew this was going to happen, if you were dismissive and cynical about so-called Project Fear, if you were perhaps informed on the issues, you understood what was likely or guaranteed to happen, you're probably not that annoyed with the analysis that I just shared. But if you voted for it and you are now, or indeed have for some time been regretful, then I may have just offended you. You may have heard, although I didn't say it, you may have heard me calling you stupid. You may have thought you heard me insulting you. When I start hitting this drum, which I don't hit with as much enthusiasm as I used to do because I don't know how it unfolds. I don't know how the damage gets repaired. But when I start hitting this drum, you start looking away. Or getting cross, or turning over maybe. I hope not. Come back. And that is one way into the conversation today. Let's have a look, shall we, at how events in London this morning are being reported in America, shall we, on CNN. The United Kingdom does not feed itself, relying heavily on the European Union for fresh fruit and vegetables. That dependency has changed little since Britain left the bloc in 2020 and could now mean more pain for consumers and small businesses. Tuesday, that's today, marks the beginning of the long-delayed introduction of post-Brexit physical inspections of plant and animal imports from the EU. The spot checks will apply initially to products such as meat, cheese and some fish, and eventually to a range of vegetables and fruit. I could go on. There's a variety of quotes from industry experts and industry groups describing thousands of pounds in extra costs each month for a typical business. Eddie Price at the Birmingham Wholesale Market, which houses around 50 businesses selling meat, fish, vegetables, flowers, describes the dismay and the concerns about higher costs and delays at the border that his people are fearing. The government estimates the checks will cost about £330 million, but they've shared absolutely no information about how they've arrived at such a low figure, while the Cold Chain Federation, which represents businesses delivering goods that need chill storage, has put the border measures closer to £1 billion a year in costs exclusively to firms trading perishable produce. That's before fruit and vegetables are even brought into the mix. The CEO of that federation, a rather splendidly named chap called Phil Pluck. You need to take a long run up at that one. It's a little bit like the North Kent Hunt. You don't want to be verbally or orally lazy when you're talking about Phil Pluck, do you? No, you don't. Well, I tell you what if Phil Pluck was a member of the North Kent Hunt? That would be a radio presenter and indeed a newsreader's nightmare, wouldn't it? Keith's finger has never hovered more menacingly above the dump button than when I moot the prospect of Phil Pluck being a member of the North Kent Hunt. But I digress. He has described a significant increase in food prices and reduction in choice, adding, "We also believe that this will seriously threaten the viability of small and medium-sized enterprises operating within food retail, such as small garden centres, restaurants and delicatessens." On it goes. 8 minutes after 10 is the time. I don't know how. Well, look, I am interested in how it's affecting you directly. Although, of course, some of the consequences will not yet have become clear. But I've told you, I've been telling you for some time, haven't I, that I need a new jam. Actually, I think jam probably will be subject to new checks coming in from Europe. But I need a new jam. I've needed a new jam for some time. Content for the con men, compassion for the conned, still holds. But now, if you are still contending that this was a good idea in any way, or that the people who sold it to you are in any way, what's the word I want, trustworthy, then I no longer have much compassion for you. I have a little bit. The ease with which people can be persuaded to believe things that are absolutely and completely untrue never ceases to amaze me. Happens in all sorts of different fields, and also people who would ordinarily perhaps consider themselves to be immune to the lure of, say, an online conspiracy theory can find themselves caught up in them to the shock of everybody around the place. So believing things that are not true is not something that automatically earns you the disapproval or the disgust of your peers. But once the evidence becomes incontrovertible, once, for example, Jacob Rees-Mogg's claim that food would be cheaper is dismantled by Jacob Rees-Mogg complaining about the checks, which I don't think he fully understands are a complete consequence of the Brexit that he brought in, that he dreamt of and helped to deliver. When the person who promised you cheap food is complaining about the consequences of more expensive food, or the causes of more expensive food, and the cause of the more expensive food is literally the thing that he told you would bring in cheaper food, then what do you do? What do you do? Do you put your fingers in your ears, close your eyes and just go la 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 la? I know people who do that in real life. I know at least one grown man who now responds to reminders of what he did during the Brexit debate by putting his fingers in his ears, closing his eyes and going la 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 la. I suspect there's people in the cabinet who respond to reminders of what they did during the Brexit conversation and what is happening now as a consequence of their either foolishness, ignorance, idiocy, or delusion. I don't know what word you want to use, but they put their fingers in their ears, they close their eyes, and they go la 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 la. 11 minutes after 10 is the time. So while I am very interested in how it is going to affect you, if you have got a business in this field, I'm also interested in people who are beginning to climb down. Now, I haven't necessarily, over the last few years, provided the most warm and welcoming environment in which you can undertake an admission of error, in which you can say, do you know what? Even if I focus it down, if I zone it right down to the Jacob Rees-Mogg conundrum. So if just that simple thing, Jacob Rees-Mogg told you that food would be cheaper and you believed him. And now you're discovering that food is going to be more expensive. And there is going to be less choice because smaller companies will not operate. Small exporters won't want to do the paperwork to send stuff to Birmingham when they could just send the same goods, the finite amount of goods that they have to sell, to Berlin instead. And companies here will therefore not be able to operate in the way that they currently do. So that very simple, focused question of Jacob Rees-Mogg and Boris Johnson and others telling you that food would be cheaper if you voted to leave the European Union, and now as an absolutely irrefutable consequence of the Brexit they delivered, food is going to be more expensive. It's rare that you have a moment of such ineffable clarity. Absolute clarity. There's no room here for he said, she said, for 52-48 ratios, for balance, for the other side of the argument. It is absolutely the case that this country was told that its food would become cheaper if we left the European Union, And today we discover the consequences of that self-same Brexit include food becoming more expensive. Now, I don't know how you do that. I don't know how you deal with that if you believed Jacob Rees-Mogg and his mates, who, of course, will be almost entirely untouched by the consequences of their own deceptions and disastrous ignorance. I don't know how you do it. How do you deal with the fact that you voted for cheaper food and you're getting more expensive food, and very, very annoying people on the radio told you at the time that you were being lied to, and you insulted them, criticised them, possibly even announced that you were celebrating by drinking their Remainer tears, and they've turned out to be right about absolutely everything. Or no, let's not even do that. Let's not reach for hyperbole. Let's focus exclusively on this single issue. They've turned out to be right about food. They've turned out to be right about Jacob Rees-Mogg. Now, I would like today to talk to you about your regrets, but history suggests that you might not be ready to do that in public. I hope you are. I've got absolutely no beef with you. It hasn't arrived yet. It's stuck in Dover, waiting to be checked. I've got absolutely no beef with you if you have seen the light. If you haven't seen the light, I have my minor beef because I think you're going to have to at some point. And the ease with which people can be persuaded to believe things. I've had a crash course this week in watching people believe things that are categorically untrue, who I genuinely thought would have slightly better skills, really, when it comes to processing actual evidence and proof. So promises that you believed have not been delivered. The exact opposite, instead, has been delivered. I want to know, can I tell you what I really want to know? Even though I'm acknowledging in the next breath that I don't think you're going to ring me today, which is why I'll ask a slightly different question in a moment. If you voted for this, if you voted for cheaper food and you're getting more expensive food, how do you want me to conduct these conversations moving forward? Can I ask you that question? How do you want me to conduct these conversations moving forward? And I can extend that invitation, of course, to everybody. Even if you are, like me, a fully paid up member of the Told You So Club. How should we be conducting these conversations? Has the point been reached where the people still claiming the opposite of observable reality, the people who are being given cheaper food, being given more expensive food and who voted for cheaper food, and are still somehow claiming vindication or validation or pretending that they believe it was worth it? Have we reached the point where they deserve to be treated with as much contempt as the con men and con women that sold it to them? I am, between you and me, I'm leaning to that position now. That the bending over backwards to accommodate the ease with which you could be persuaded into a silly, nation-damaging, unpatriotic vote is pretty close to exhausted. But, I'm not sure. So if you voted for it, how do you want me to conduct these conversations? Specifically about food, okay? 0345 6060973. And for the rest of us, how should we conduct this conversation now? Especially if you are directly affected by these facts. Remember that an awful lot of the media outlets, whether individuals or institutions that helped to sell the con, that helped to sell Brexit, are still in control of the flow of information. So an awful lot of customers are not going to be able to distinguish between general inflation or Ukraine-linked inflation or cost of living crisis. Well, that's a consequence rather than a cause. But they're not going to know the specifics of these deals. You've got to turn this morning to the BBC, which of course routinely comes under attack from the people that I'm talking about, or foreign media, CNN, speaking to people at Birmingham Wholesale Market, quoting the numbers, seeing how much food comes in from places like the Netherlands, France, Ireland, Germany. Looking at the actual consequences of watching 40% of fresh vegetables in this country consumed in 2022 now being subject to higher costs and checks than it was before. How do we conduct the conversation without sounding smug or obnoxious? I fully accept that's harder for some of us than it is for others. But how do we conduct the conversation now while the reality is still going to be ignored or denied by the people who helped to deliver it? All right? So lots of ways into this. How it's affecting you personally, 0345 6060973. And the tone, the content, the timbre of the conversation that you want to hear, especially if you voted for this, and this is crucial, if you voted for sovereignty or some other nonsense, I'm afraid you're lying to yourself, and I've got no interest in you lying to me. If you thought you were going to get cheap food, and now you know it's going to be more expensive, how do you want me to talk about this moving forward? Because somebody has to. Somebody has to. Hit the numbers now, you will get through. 21 minutes after 10. James writes, Steve, you're not going to get Brexiteers to call in. They've hurt themselves, but they've also hurt the poorest people in the country. I think it's often the same. I think that Venn diagram often looks like a circle, Steve. They should be forced to wear a special cap to identify the idiots. Again, if I'm asking about the tone we should be having in this conversation, I have to accept the suggestion that we should be a hell of a lot ruder. And I'm not, I'm afraid, indulging any more in ludicrous claims that you voted for some sort of different type of thing from the ones that all the people leading the Brexit campaign told you were going to get. Oh, I voted because I don't like centralised power, or I don't want our laws to be. Just seriously, get over yourself. Look what you've done. Look what you've done to all of us. Look what you've done to your own children's futures. Look what you've done to your own food bill. The idea that it's all worth it because of some meaningless, nebulous, entirely intangible word that you don't really understand, like sovereignty, is insulting. Not so much to your intelligence, but to everybody else's. 22 minutes after 10 is the time. John's in Coventry. John, what's going on?
Oh, hello, James. How you doing?
Good, mate.
So cards on the table. Yeah. I voted for Brexit. At the time, going back in history, we were coming through austerity. The Tories, a complete hatchet job on selling it to the public. They just said, it's a minor vote. All this stuff we've been feeding you over the years about sovereignty and laws and all that.
I'll give you laws, but there was nothing on sovereignty. Sovereignty was barely mentioned until after the result had come through. But the idea that we were subject to laws that we didn't want to be subject to, and that therefore we had to break out of these shackles, that was an incredibly commonplace position.
I mean, I lived through this. I think the press were culpable because the story for Remain was totally, shielded out.
Yeah.
We didn't start talking about a no-deal Brexit till 2018, 2019.
Yeah.
Just came out with that and they said, oh, what is this? Then we started talking about the Irish border. This should have all been talked about 4 years before 2016.
Well, it was, but people shouted at the top of their voices, Project Fear. I had Jacob Rees-Mogg on this programme. We kind of ambushed him on St. Stephen's Green. He didn't know he was on the other end of the microphone, and he sat there and talked utter gibberish. But at the time, I couldn't prove it was gibberish because he would say, no, Father Christmas will be arriving tonight and dropping lots of presents down your chimney, and I couldn't then say anything that proved him wrong. Now, it's here. Yeah, we're all sitting around the fireplace and there's no presents coming down the chimney. It is absolutely inarguable now that there were massive lies and huge displays of ignorance. So how do you, as someone who, with respect, fell for it, and I've got no beef with people that fell for it because it's stuck in Dover waiting to be checked at customs, how do you want these conversations to be conducted? And you're not allowed to say you don't want them to be conducted at all.
I just think that basically, my favourite is carpetbaggers. So, you have people coming along, selling you snake oil, selling you, Abbot. And the only people who really did well out of this are people who are millionaires. They've got cheap workers. They've got active practices.
Final's going a bit south, but I'm not even sure that holds up much anymore. Some people made a ton of money on the night by sort of betting on the markets and betting on the pound. But I don't know who comes out of this better. A lot of people telling me it had nothing to do with food. Let me read you this, actually. This is quite funny. James still doesn't get it. It has nothing to do with food, which is what people send to me when they don't want to say, I voted Brexit to get rid of all the foreigners. So in a way, you could have the same conversation. You voted to get rid of all the foreigners. Well, getting rid of all the foreigners would make your food go up in cost as well, because the workforce, particularly in agriculture, has been decimated. But you've also ended up with higher immigration than we've ever had before. So you're much stupider than the people who were voting for cheap food, because you were not only motivated by bigotry and xenophobia, but you've been sold an even bigger pup than the people who believe the cheap food claims. John, thank you. Keith's in Sutton in Craven in North Yorkshire. Keith, what would you like to say?
Hello, James.
Hello, Keith.
All I can say really is that the only way I voted for Brexit.
Yeah.
And I used to listen to you rambling on about how it's such a bad thing. And I used to think, God, what
Rambling on. How dare you, Keith? How dare you?
But then now I realise that everything you said were right. And the only way I deal with it personally is by just accepting that I made a stupid mistake, and it's probably it's down in my mind as probably one of the biggest mistakes I've made in my life, and I was stupid, and I
politically, but you believe people who are incredibly plausible and incredibly powerful. I don't like hearing that sort of self-flagellation, because I genuinely subscribe to the contempt for the con men, compassion for the con. But I am interested in how you think the conversation should continue, because even I am tempted never to ramble on about Brexit again. Even I quite like the idea of parking it for a few generations and never talking, but I don't think we can. I don't think the farmers. I think the farmers deserve better. Never mind the consumers, the importers, the exports. So how do you think the conversation should be conducted moving forward?
I think it should be conducted exactly in the manner that you're conducting it. I think that you do show compassion for people like me, but there is an element in your manner that we were stupid, which I accept and agree with. And I think you've got to carry on talking about it, because one day, hopefully, this stupidity will be reversed.
It's a very big difference. Thank you, because there's a very big difference between saying you did a stupid thing and you are a stupid person, isn't there? A very big difference.
Yes, there is. Yeah.
And that's crucial. Whereabouts is Sutton in Craven? I thought I knew North Yorkshire. I've not heard of Sutton in Craven.
It's between Skipton and Keighley, equidistance.
Okay.
Near Cross Hills, Steeton, Mailvoice, Quireland.
Eastbourne.
Eastbourne, you've got it.
I know Eastbourne.
Yeah,
right, you are. Yeah. Okay. Oh, well, there you go. I'll add it to my list. Thank you, Keith. 28 minutes after 10 is the time. Steve's in Crawley. Steve, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James.
Hello.
Yes, I'll put the dunce's hat on, I'm afraid. I did vote for it.
Yeah.
My wife now thinks the entire thing is my fault.
I like that. Should we call it Steve's Brexit, I think, from now on?
Absolutely, it's totally my fault. Now, we've spoken before. I'm the photographer.
Yes.
I was doing a shoot literally a couple of weeks before Brexit, about Brexit, in the House of the Commons. There was 3 MPs talking, and if you asked me, I couldn't remember who they were.
Sure.
There was 3 MPs talking, 1 for, 1 against, 1 on the fence.
Okay.
And I fell into the hole of the 4. I totally agree. I actually went into the voting booth intending to vote against, and did I'd call it the Trump thing.
Did you
voted
really?
For change.
Yeah.
Voted for change and desperately regret it. Desperately regret it.
And we can't not talk about it, can we? I mean,
No.
Tempting though it might be, from both sides of this divide, tempting though it might be to say, you won, get over it, which is a phrase actually that hasn't yet reached the kind of popular, but that is what you won, get over it. We can't not talk about it, because look what's happening today. Look what's happening to everybody from, small delicatessens to big cold chain importers.
Yeah, I need you to carry on doing exactly what you're doing and talking truth to power. And just making people like me, and I don't think I'm stupid.
No, I don't think you're
people
stupid.
Like me, see how idiotic they are. You've still got some politicians thinking it's the best thing ever. It's unbelievable.
It is. That's mad, isn't it? That level of I don't know whether it's delusion or something more sinister, but the idea that people will still stand up and claim, and not just politicians, plenty of people, well, fewer and fewer people in my line of work, actually, but still some who will pretend that it was a good idea. Or, my favourite at the moment, there is a really, really good Brexit, but it goes to a different school. But I think part of the trick is to focus in on the very specifics of it. So today's phone-in is about the food. The food is more expensive. It was supposed to be cheaper. And, I've got a text here from someone in Lancashire saying, well, it's not that much more expensive. That's not the point. If someone sold you a promise that something will be cheaper, then you ask for a refund if it's not cheaper. You don't say, oh, well, it's actually gone up in price, not down, but not by that much. And, of course, as a consumer, inflation's already hit us pretty hard. Cost of living crisis already underway. Energy bills already pretty punitive for many people. But for people in the business, this is an existential threat. And it was both predicted and described. And that's why I think people are finding it a little easier than I expected to put their hands up. That, of course, coupled with the warmth of the welcome that you always get on this programme. 10:31 is the time. Thomas Watts has your headlines. It is 10:34. Charlie's in Bath. He says, James, on days like today, my contempt for the likes of Aaron Banks and Andy Wigmore. Who's Andy Wigmore? Oh, the butler. The kind of, yeah, okay. Farage, Habib, Johnson, Rees-Mogg, Baker, they're all as contemptible. But people need reminding about the puppet masters pulling the strings in the background, not the puppets. I mean, Jack Cade makes a rather nice line. We're all Ramonas now. We've got two new catchphrases. The first is "You won, get over it," which I don't think will catch on, but "We're all Ramonas now" has a certain ring to it. Rebecca is in Glasgow. Rebecca, what would you like to say?
Hi, I voted to remain, but my mum voted to leave.
Right.
My mum was born to Polish immigrants, and
gosh.
I just couldn't understand. And I just felt like she was pulling up a ladder. And it was just, I was so angry with her. I've changed, that anger has turned to absolute sympathy when I see the regret in her face. And it's simple little things like she'll do a shop and she'll come on the phone to me and say, God, those Polish things that I buy in the supermarkets they're not there, or they cost so much more. And it's just that there's this frustration in her now. But I don't blame voters any longer.
Has she joined the dots?
Yes, very much.
And therefore rues the day.
Very much. And I think it's been down to successive governments.
Yeah.
Because everybody is manipulated in some way. And successive governments have sold off our industries. They've outsourced. We don't produce things anymore. We bring them in.
Yeah, it's a mad combination of circumstances, isn't it? And in fact, one of the sort of chief idiots was writing this week about, I think it was Frost or possibly Nick Timothy, one of the Daily Telegraph weirdos, was writing this week about, oh no, we need to make more, we need to manufacture more. And you're just, okay, but let's not pull ourselves out of the biggest single market in the world and then realise that we don't produce our own.
That's exactly it. We just left ourselves isolated.
I can't believe I just said that out loud. I haven't seen it that clearly before. Let's leave it and then work out the consequences. Mm-hmm. Oh my days!
So she regrets it, and I now have sympathy.
Good. For
the people who bought into this, because we're all manipulated. Let's face it. In some way or another, at some point we have that eureka moment.
Usually, yes, but I've had a crash course this week in watching people who would almost certainly have voted Remain and indeed see themselves as far too clever to fall for internet conspiracy theories, queuing up to shout their support for all manner of unevidenced nonsense. So that's how you can still love your mum. And how bad was the fracture? How bad was the falling out?
Oh, there were times when we couldn't even look each other in the eye. Good
grief. And who do you blame? Individuals that you blame, if you don't mind, or your mum blames, the people that, if you like, radicalised her?
Well, she blames, there was the TV programmes that she watched.
Yeah.
she literally would
The fake balance.
spout word for word. And the government, she blamed the government. She said, well, this is what they told us. I said, but I was trying to tell you something different. Yes, but. So, that's what made me angry, was the fact that I'm trying to show her, but she wasn't listening.
That for me at least, and I'm not putting words in your mouth, for me at least, that's where the BBC actually was culpable. Not just people who were allowed to express opinions on the radio, but got it all horribly wrong. That's human fallibility in a way. But the BBC pretending, it's what Emily Maitlis calls it, the Minford paradigm, where they wouldn't tell you that there's only one economist in the building who is prepared to publicly state that Brexit is a good idea, and there are 5,000 convinced that it's awful. And yet if you watched it on the BBC, it was 50-50. It wasn't even 52-48. It was like, and that's how people like your mum ended up thinking. It's probably a good idea, and if it's not a great idea, it can't be that bad, because look, I'm watching Question Time, and the quotes, clever people, end quotes, are just disagreeing with each other, so it must be 50-50, never 50-50. Johnny's in Horsham. Johnny, what would you like to say?
Hi there. We spoke before, actually, about Corbyn. Yeah, it's in agreement to what you're saying, but if I can, I was just going to give a little explanation of the consequences further on than the cost of food.
Yes, of course. Briefly, though, because I am trying to focus on food today.
Yeah, no, it is food, but I'll bridge it as best as possible. I live in an area where there was a huge fruit farm, summer fruits, berries. These were picked normally by Eastern Europeans, predominantly Romanians. Yes. But because of Brexit, they all left for fear or for income or for whatever reason. They didn't come, and for 2 years subsequent, the harvest rotted because British people wouldn't work for that money for those hours. So what subsequently has happened is the guy who owned the farm has moved his business to Romania and is continuing, and the cost per punnet per unit is massively more. And he used to sell to Tesco, Sainsbury's, big supermarkets. It costs them massively more per tonne than it ever cost having it in the UK. But the consequence continues. What's happened to that land? He's put holiday homes on it.
Right.
So now people come and spend a couple of days in the summer and leave. In winter, the area's dark, it's shut. All the corner shops, the pubs, the chip shop, the petrol stations that these people used to use are gone.
Oh, that's...
Because
Because it was... hang on, because they're not... I mean, devil's advocate hat on. I don't want to doubt what you're telling me, but the holiday makers are going to contribute to the local economy.
No, they're holiday homes. They're families, not hundreds of people picking fruit.
Right.
The houses on there, the houses with land.
But that wouldn't be all year round, would it? They wouldn't be picking fruit all year.
But they're not going to get up every day and go to, you know, you may
you're
have...
You're there, I believe. You've got no reason not to believe
I go through there to go surfing. Honestly, it's not my opinion. It's the opinion of the locals. And you can see the look of people who live there with this, we made a terrible decision. We got it wrong. And I just think we have to approach it with some kind of empathy. If you shout them down because they got it wrong, they'll get defensive. And I get people saying to me, oh, well, we voted to leave. We can't vote to change it. We voted to join in 75. We voted to leave in 20.
Yeah, but that's a big... I mean, that's a...
we want.
16 to 30, it's nearly 40 years, isn't it? And it's going to be awful waiting that long. But you've reminded me of another story about Heineken. Have you seen the story about the orchards that Heineken have just ripped up? I'm wondering whether that's part of the same phenomenon that you described. There's Heineken owns Bulmers, the well-known cider brewer, and it wants to sell the land. I wonder if it is also looking at selling it to property developers. And before putting it on the market, they've torn up an orchard the size of 140 football pitches on the Offers Dyke Path in Monmouthshire.
It may well be. But the consequences is we're paying more for our summer berries and our summer fruits and our strawberries, as are the manufacturers that use them for cakes and jellies like Kensey Foods in Cornwall that use them. It cost them more for the produce, and all the little corner shops that had all these people coming in don't have that. The consequences are vast. It's huge.
And not reported, and that's why I mean tone is important, but discussing it is incredibly important as well. 10:42 is the time. I'm just looking that up while listening to Johnny, and there's suggestions as well that it might be the decline in the cider market that has contributed to that decision as well. The National Association of Cider Makers saying 2,000 acres of British cider orchards have been lost in the past few years. And that the amount of cider being drunk in the UK has dropped by a third over the last 10. So I guess it's really important when you're dealing in fact not to spin the other way. So my suggestion that orchard devastation in Monmouthshire might be linked to the same phenomenon that Johnny was describing was not justified. I don't think it was justified. 10:43 is the time. Harry's in Chelmsford. Harry, what would you like to say?
Hiya.
Hello, Harry.
I'm a young person, and I've only been 21 years old. So I wasn't even able to vote for Brexit when it was about. And I think ever since it sort of appeared and hasn't disappeared, I suppose,
yes.
The country is sort of, declined in a way, especially for young people.
It's hard for you to measure it because it's all you've ever known, if you see what I mean. So you can imagine what freedom of movement would have been like. And you can today, an awful lot of people a lot older than you are finally beginning to realise what it meant to be in a single market, so that you could buy stuff that was in Berlin this morning. You can have it on your breakfast table by tomorrow, and there would be absolutely no friction or cost involved in any way different from how if it was coming in from Bath or Bristol. I mean, that is mad to get your head around. But you talk of decline. What do you mean when you talk of decline?
I think in more of a broader term, not just food related, especially food related. It's going to cost more money to get healthier and more naturally grown foods. So it comes to that point of it's cheaper for people to get unhealthy, quick, fast foods.
That's another consequence. Yeah, you're absolutely right.
And then the country's health then starts to decline in that sense, and then it puts more pressure on the NHS. And it's all a big knock-on effect of everything. So everything has a consequence, and then everything.
And people won't be able to understand what's going on unless we talk about it and describe it in the way that you're doing, actually. How does it play at home? How does that vote split, how has that developed?
I mean, I contribute at home. I can't afford to move out anytime soon.
I mean the fact that your parents voted in different directions. Has one of them put their hands up and said they made a mistake, or is it just off the menu?
I think it's just been completely wiped the slate clean, and just no one talks about it. But I was a bit too young to sort of understand it at that time.
Of course.
And I'm trying to now. I'm at that sort of voting age. I turned 18 during COVID, so there wasn't sort of any sort of votes about when I turned 18. So it's all coming about now, and I'm trying to educate myself on what's sort of there and what's about.
Well, I don't want to add to your burdens, Harry, but it might well be that it might fall to your generation to undo a lot of the damage done by us old people, or by whichever one of your parents it was that voted to become part of the first population in history to impose economic sanctions on itself. But it's not just young people. Chris has been in touch. I just presume Chris is older. And he simply says, "Forgive my ignorance." Always, I always forgive ignorance. If you admit ignorance, it's always to be forgiven. I do realise we have left the EU, but the food coming in from the EU is not any different from before. So why do we now need the checks? Please explain, Chris. Treaties. It is simply the case that you have borders, national borders, international borders, over which countries exercise control, and if you all agree to pool resources to become part of the same single market, then you can sign treaties that deliver things like freedom of movement of goods, freedom of movement of labour, and freedom of movement of services. And if the rules say, if you sign up for one of those, you have to sign up for all three, then those are the only circumstances in which you can have freedom of movement of goods. So from the minute, and forgive me, Chris, if I've misunderstood your question and you already know all this, but from the minute that Theresa May decided that she had to appease the freedom of movement of people mob, i.e. abolish freedom of movement of people. And remember, people like Priti Patel until very recently were telling you to celebrate the abolition of your own freedom. So as soon as Theresa May decided to do that, then freedom of movement of goods was off the table. There were no circumstances in which we could abolish freedom of movement of people without sacrificing our membership of an organisation that enjoyed freedom of movement of goods. So those goods have to be checked coming in, not because of European Union rules, but because of World Trade Organization rules, which, of course, the Brexit headbangers also insisted, without understanding anything, would be brilliant. 10:48 is the time. So that's an interesting one as well, the combination there of Harry's call and Chris's WhatsApp message, reminding us all of the importance of continuing to explain everything, even as people like Jacob Rees-Mogg have somehow scaled ever dizzier heights of delusion. Just simple, calm, honest explanation. Otherwise, if there is a vacuum of information, then all manner of madnesses can move into it. And sometimes I expect it's very hard to resist the temptation to sign up to the madness that has moved into a vacuum. But you should probably always resist that temptation. It's 10:49. Not my strong suit, mental arithmetic. It used to be much better. When I worked behind a bar, it was good. But I do, you're quite right, Gavin in Nantes. It's very important to correct. He says, please check your maths. 1975 until Brexit was not, as you said, nearly 40 years that we were members. It was nearly 50. Could you please clarify to your listeners that when we left the EU, we didn't also lose 10 years, as well as everything else? I think he is suggesting. So thank you. That's quite all right, Gavin. It's a 75 plus 25 plus 16, 31. No. You've done me wrong there. 75. So it's 25 years plus 16 years, which is 41 years. So 50 years to now, but nearer 40. Anyway, never mind, because this is a much more entertaining WhatsApp that's come in. This is from Stephen. Steve, I think you might have the LBC number stored in your phone next to the number of a loved one, because you just sent me a message that says, drive carefully on your way into town, my love. The lava lamp is still in the boot of your car. I'm just wondering, is that a secret code, do you think? Do you think Steve is actually sending me a message from the security services, or... Drive carefully on your way into town, my love. The lava lamp is still in the boot of your car. So you could, if you sit down at a park bench today and someone sits next to you and says, the lava lamp is still in the boot of your car, then you'll know it's Steve. Stephen, actually, I do apologise. Now, let's go to Sevington, which I doubt you've ever heard of. It's in Kent, and it is the site of something called an inland border facility, which is a government-managed checkpoint where the majority of some of the new checks that we are discussing today will be conducted. It's already cost you, the taxpayer, £147 million, and it is where Emma Core, LBC's correspondent, has found herself this morning. Emma, what are you doing there, and what have you learned?
Well, James, I'm actually stood watching hundreds of lorries roll through this 230-acre site here in Sevington. It's a huge concrete car park, really, and built purposely for this moment to conduct physical checks on European goods. And from where I am right now, I can catch a glimpse of lorries being directed in and then pulling up to bays to have those checks done this morning. And how this is working, James, it's meat, fish, dairy and plants now having to be inspected under new government rules. Fruit and veg will be checked, but the government has pushed that back until the autumn, I think, really because of the enormous impact that's going to have. And the UK would probably struggle to cope if all these checks came in at once. But we already know, and the government have said, these checks are going to cost importers collectively £330 million a year. Now, that means for the average high street wholesaler, for example, let's say a person who wants fresh meat or eggs brought into cafes, hospitals, schools. They're now having to battle with huge hikes to their costs paying for these checks, which we've been told will inevitably be passed on to customers. Nigel Jenny is the head of the Fresh Produce Consortium and has told me these costs will cripple some businesses.
It will cost the industry approximately £200 million a year. But in reality, for smaller businesses, it will cost them in relative terms more. We envisage that would be £50,000 to £60,000 a year, which is a huge cost.
And James, I've been speaking to traders here in the UK too. One farmer, Guy Watson Singh, who runs Riverford Organic Farms, a big company in both Devon and France, says the costs for him now are huge.
Certainly costing us £1 million a year. To comply with the post-Brexit arrangements. And it's just so frustrating. It's £1 million a year, which could so better be spent on putting up solar panels, windmills, planting trees.
Well, concerns as well too, James, that any delays caused by these physical inspections here at Sevington, which are expected to take around 4 hours per lorry, could mean some foods and plants being thrown away. Of course, all these products have a very short shelf life. If you've got meat in the back of a lorry, a supermarket will only be able to put that on the shelf if it's got a reasonable shelf life. So there's a huge concern as well from traders around that. I actually visited a horticultural nursery in Kent a couple of weeks ago who themselves are really worried about that, because plants likewise can't sit in lorries for hours on end without being killed off. And this site as well, James, 22 miles away from Dover. Checks were done in Dover before. So the meat, the fish, the dairy products and plants all rolling off lorries there are now having to be inspected here. They've got to make that 22-mile journey, which has time to their delivery as well.
And just to be absolutely clear, Emma, this is, to coin a fairly unpleasant phrase, this is the new normal. This is not a temporary measure while things are introduced or while the system recalibrates. This is what happens now. This is the new reality.
Yeah, absolutely, James. This is the new normal. This site here in Sevington has been here for a few years. Of course, we thought these checks were going to come in back in 2021. They've been delayed multiple times and are now finally being brought in. Delayed is thought perhaps because of concerns around inflation, bringing up food prices again. It's obviously thought that food prices, perhaps supermarkets can cope with that now. But as I said, traders are saying that food prices are going to increase because but businesses have got to absorb these physical check costs. And yeah, as you say, for the foreseeable. And
the government's figure then, which you mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, looks, to say the very least, incredibly optimistic. The £330 million a year, when you're speaking to business people who reckon they're in the hole for at least £1 million each in some cases.
Yeah, £330 million a year, they're saying, costing importers collectively, the government. We've spoken to businesses that are saying it's going to cost them £60,000 a month. Bigger businesses, some saying it potentially will cost that a year. But I think it's really the small businesses. You've got the delis, the small little high street businesses that bring in, foods from Europe that people enjoy to buy, of course. They're going to be the ones that struggle the most because they can't absorb these costs. And also, if you think about a lorry full of food they're bringing over, they've got lots of different items on board that lorry. A lorry going to a supermarket might just be full of one type of cheese. But that's going to be like one cost. But if you've got that lorry full of different types of consignments, they're all going to have their own costs. So you can see how small businesses are going to suffer more.
That is a point that was made on this programme as long ago as 2016 by greengrocers and couriers and delivery people, and yet to hear it laid out in such stark terms is strangely depressing. Emma Core, thank you. You're doing incredible work and very, very important work. Although, of course, there are some parts that it will not reach. This text came in while Emma was talking about what she could currently see with her own eyes. All right, just think about that for a minute. She is standing in Sevington in Kent, watching lorries come in for checks that could take up to 3 to 4 hours, and speaking to the business owners affected who are explaining to her the costs. And this character texted the programme, more Project Fear bore off. And I believe they have their own television programme now on one of these weird new television stations that have been funded by precisely the sort of billionaires that, for reasons known only to themselves, sold you Brexit. It's 4 minutes after 11. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. We got it right today. I'm not sure how. Do you think it's timing? Do you think it is the fact that our news bulletins and correspondents like Emma Core, they're down in Sevington, are just delivering the cold, hard facts of Brexit? So even if you still have people on the station who sold it to you pretending that everything's going swimmingly or that Boris Johnson is a stand-up guy, the tone changes when the facts change. What do you do when the facts change? I change my mind. I don't know. I'm just wondering out loud about why today we got the invitation right. People are now ready to have a chat, a friendly chat, a warm chat from people who are part of the same society about how best to proceed with and after the acknowledgement that if you voted for cheaper food, you are getting the precise and polar opposite of what you were promised by people like... And I think Jacob Rees-Mogg is a good example because he was one of the people who seemed to be most shameless in his depictions of the impossible. And I had some personal experience of it. Very different from talking to someone like Farage, who I don't think really believes in anything really except self-promotion. Rees-Mogg seemed to be ideologically wed to the wisdom of leaving the European Union and would therefore claim things that seemed fanciful at the time with a plausibility that many people found persuasive, which is why this moment from, I think, one of those weird little windows in British politics where he had a senior job in government, this moment was so significant that the inevitability and necessity of having these checks in place is a consequence of World Trade Organization membership, meeting, departure, or abandonment of European Union membership. The rules on what checks need to be in place at borders are part of international trade. There's no such thing as an independent sovereign trading nation. You have to abide by international rules. And the moment where Jacob Rees-Mogg displayed not just his failure to understand this, but his utter ignorance about his role and responsibility for actions, laws, changes that he could see coming in, was a moment of, even by the standards of Brexit, it was a moment of epic significance that inevitably went largely unremarked by the kind of people who were either complicit in or contributed to or fell for his drawling bilge of the penny farthing in human form.
I thought post-Brexit checks were not going to be disruptive.
That's why we're not adopting them. This would have been an act of self-harm if we'd gone ahead with it. It would have increased costs for people.
That's just mad, right? Because they have to go ahead with it. They're going ahead with it today. They literally have to. They literally have no choice but to go ahead with this thing that he told you would bring about cheaper food. And here he is describing the inevitable and literal consequence of the thing that he told you would bring down your food bills.
I thought post-Brexit checks were not going to be disruptive.
That's why we're not adopting them. This would have been an act of self-harm if we'd gone ahead with it. It would have increased costs for people.
David Sutton writes, it was Daniel Hannan who finally convinced me to vote Brexit. I was duped and I'm so sorry. We all make mistakes, you know. Very, very easy to believe things that aren't true if you want to. I've mentioned a couple of times, I've had a crash course this week in watching people who I thought would know a hell of a lot better, signing up with great enthusiasm for complete bilge. So I'm not here to judge you. I'm just here to wonder how best to proceed these conversations. Andy's in Walsall. Andy, sorry to keep you. What would you like to say?
That's okay. Hi, mate.
Hello.
Well, I was one of the ones that were duped by the likes of Rees-Mogg and Boris into voting for coming out of Europe. We live in the dream. The big difference for me is, at the time, the people who were selling to stay in Europe couldn't sell a chocolate to Cadbury's.
No, that's a really important point, actually.
They never got their game up, did they?
No, never.
You know, and because of that, people like myself who were sold the dream that we're better off being as one, we're obviously not. You know, we're always, as a human race, we're a family. You know, and because of that, we've now been isolated, and all of our family are saying, well, should have thought of that before you voted to leave. If the people who wanted us to stay in Europe had got their ideas across better, I don't think we would have been in this situation, because the vote was tight anyway.
You're so right. You are.
And they just didn't get their
102,
their
and you know who it was? It was David Cameron and Jeremy Corbyn. They were the ones charged with keeping us in, and Jeremy Corbyn wouldn't share a platform with David Cameron, and David Cameron wouldn't acknowledge that a lot of the reason why people wanted change was because they had been mistakenly led to believe that the consequences of austerity were consequences of European Union membership.
Well, they led us this belief that Britain's economy is going to get better, the prices are going to go down, the NHS is going to be the best that it's ever been. Can't get medication in due to it all going into Europe. They're not sending it over here, so we've got shortages, which adds increased costs. Then you've got the food, which now we have to check everything, increased costs, whereas we had freedom of movement. I'm a firm believer that we need to, as a country, we need to bite the bullet, and we need to go as far as having a new referendum.
Good grief.
To go back into Europe.
When did you shift? When I mean, was it a quick process?
I'm a travel agent as
well.
Oh,
Andy,
so
Andy.
We've got all of that, you know. At the time I wasn't. I was a coach driver, but
okay.
But now I'm a travel agent. I'm seeing it for its own worth, and you know, I'm big enough and ugly enough to say I voted incorrectly. You know, give me my time again. And I think quite a few thousands of people would do exactly the same. And I think the result will be totally different now, because we've lived the so-called dream that has turned into a nightmare.
We've seen it, and that's why I think it's helpful, albeit that there's loads of other issues we could be talking about. Today, at least, you zone in on the very simple question of food prices and what Brexit has done to them. And it has done the exact opposite of what they told us it would do. I wonder, though, the thing is, Andy, at the time, I don't know if you were listening to the programme, but I came up with this catchphrase that it's easier to sell tickets for the ghost train than it is for the speak your weight machine, which is true. And I'm not here to defend David Cameron and Jeremy Corbyn, not for a nanosecond. I think their leadership was delinquent, incredibly bad. But selling that intoxicating lie is always going to be a hell of a lot easier than selling the dull, inalienable truth, isn't it?
Well, at the end of the day, I've used the analogy of it a bit being like buying a car. Would you buy a car off Boris and Rees-Mogg or buy one off Corbyn and Cameron, who wouldn't be able to sell chocolate to Cadbury's, you know? And I think a lot of us were duped into buying a car off Rees-Mogg and
brilliant
Boris
analogy.
Johnson.
I don't know if I'd buy a car off Rees-Mogg, possibly a penny farthing, but Boris Johnson...
No, but how we sold the European argument at
I know, I'm listening.
It was spot on, do you know what I mean?
And that's why the sort of spiv-like fraudulence of Boris Johnson was brilliant, because you would buy a second-hand car off that man.
The one thing that we can do as a human is we can always accept that we were wrong. And that then we can, you know, I'm sure Europe would bite our hands off to get us back in.
Of course they would, because it's to the benefit of the single market to have a big and less powerful than we were before. But strength is size, strength is in numbers. Andy, thank you. You've given me lots of food for thought there, and very kind. Well, kind, that's not quite the right word. But Alan was complaining just before you came on that we weren't holding the Remain campaign to account. Caroline defends them slightly by saying, well, they weren't using lies and underhand tactics, but they could have done a hell of a lot better, Caroline, without having to resort to lies and underhand tactics. And while we're on the subject, Alan, your criticism was valid. It's taken an hour to recognise that the responsibility for much of this lies with the people who failed to stop it. And that would very much be David Cameron and Jeremy Corbyn, both of whom get an entire chapter in How They Broke Britain, which looks at an awful lot of this stuff. And I should mention that if you're in London today, there are orange plaques mysteriously appearing around the capital, which all allude to the starring roles in that book, which is out in paperback this week. But yeah, Corbyn and Cameron both get a chapter for reasons that are pretty obvious now to anybody paying attention. And I just to slightly address some of Andy's optimism, let me remind you of the words of Michel Barnier, says Damien. The UK can vote itself out of the EU. They cannot vote themselves in again. I think we'd be welcome. but I don't think it's going to happen for a very long time, and it certainly wouldn't be on our own terms. Raj is in Chelmsford. Raj, what would you like to say?
Hi there. Yes, so I basically did vote Brexit, and I put my hands up that I think a few minutes after I did, or a few minutes after the result came through, that was the first point when I realised I made a mistake, and the reason was I was actually in London. I was on a train. I think David Cameron announced. I think that David Cameron announced it, if I recall right.
Well, no, it got announced on the telly, but he announced his resignation pretty much 10 minutes later.
Yeah, sure. So I think I was listening to it over the radio, and I was at Wembley Park Station, and I got on the train, and I saw there was a lot of European people on the train, basically, because there was a lot of Europeans here working.
Yeah.
And when that announcement came through, I think it came through on the station, at the train station.
Really?
And yeah, I think so. They mentioned something.
Okay.
I just saw the faces of all the European people. They literally put their heads put their heads down.
Well, you would do. And they're the same people that Farage had been complaining about speaking foreign on trains a couple of years previously. But of course, he failed to mention that his own children speak German, their mother tongue, to their mother, who's German. I don't know about that, Raj. I don't want to doubt. Maybe your memory is playing tricks on you, but it was a fairly mad time, certainly for me, and that is steering away slightly from the conversation about food. That certainly for me, that the most memorable and poignant calls were the ones from people who introduced us to that phrase that we have heard many times since on the programme. It was, "I don't mean you." People telling us. I remember the French psychiatrist telling us that her own patients were telling her that they'd voted to leave the European Union because they wanted to get rid of all the immigrants. And she said, "But I'm an immigrant." And they said, "No, we don't mean you." People telling us their own mother-in-law had voted to leave the European Union because they wanted to get rid of all the immigrants. I said, "Well, I'm an immigrant." And she'd say, "Oh, and I don't mean you." And something very similar is happening with a different area of life today, which actually gives us quite a timely moment for an unhinged headline, which I can't quite believe is in print in the UK today. And we'll do it, I think, after this. 18 minutes after 11. When I selected today's unhinged headline, I hadn't clocked who'd actually written the article beneath it. And it couldn't be more timely because it's a person who wrote that book, that David Cameron biography that was published under Lord Ashcroft's name, Isabel Oakeshott, who I think is the partner of the fella running Nigel Farage's business, the Reform Party. Which is so timely, because we're talking about Brexit, and I've reminded you how they demonised immigration to get it over the line, but they didn't mean you. They just wanted to get rid of all the immigrants, but they didn't mean you. So today's unhinged headline, and what it tells you about the people that sold you Brexit is, well, almost perfect.
Unhinged headline.
So here it is in the Telegraph. Get benefits claimants back to work, cleaning our filthy streets. It's going well then, is it, your Brexit? Going really, really well. Get benefits claimants back to work, cleaning our filthy streets. We could chain them up as well, couldn't we? There'd be a name for that. Chain gangs, that would be good. Punishing people for being unemployed or punishing people for being ill. I kind of rings a bell from history, but I can't quite remember where. And that is today's
Unhinged headline.
Or at least it's the first one. There may be others. We shall have to wait and see. People don't want to admit their own stupidity, so they will defend Brexit till their dying day. That came in at 10:18 today, and I think it has been successfully repudiated. Is that the right word? Successfully disproved. I think that it is beholden upon all of us to start pulling together. And if we're going to pull together, we've got to agree on what the rope looks like. And the rope looks like Brexit was a really stupid idea. So it doesn't really matter whether you voted for it or not. If we're all going to start trying to pull the country in the direction it needs to be pulled in, whether it takes years, decades, or more, generations, the first thing you've got to do is stop shouting at each other and being cross with the people that made what I would describe as an honest mistake. All right? I can extend that to the food, which today we discover will be more expensive, not cheaper. I can extend that to the food. I can't necessarily extend it to the immigration yet, not least because that's arguably gone even worse than the promise that the food would be cheaper. So on we go. Tim's in Banham in Norfolk. Tim, what would you like to say?
Morning, James.
Hello, mate.
I felt compelled to call after the lady that was on earlier talking about the conflict she had with her mother during the Brexit process. We experienced a very similar, but even more bizarre situation in that my wife and my children enjoyed the freedoms of the European Union. We actually lived in France at the time, and our entire livelihood was linked to freedom of movement. We worked for an estate agency in France, and we sold an awful lot of properties to expats, etc.
Oh wow!
And we had immense conflict within our families back in the UK, where family members were adamant that Brexit was a great thing. We tried to point out that their family benefited from freedom of movement, but they weren't buying it.
Yeah.
And I think the point I wanted to make, because there is a link to food in a minute, but the point I wanted to make was that I'm now watching the exact same lies being told through the media channels, that these same family members are now believing the lies about the immigration, the lies about the NHS. All the NHS woes, as far as they're concerned, is because of junior doctor strikes. And it's frightening that we keep recycling this same situation where the people that are responsible for these lies are not held to account. You touched on it earlier. You touched on it earlier this week, or last week, sorry, when you were talking about Chris Philp. He then gets to go on BBC on Sunday morning and defend his rhetorical question, and nobody really
pushed back. Well, that might be a consequence of who presents that programme. But the idea that he got a free pass on claiming that, it was a rhetorical question, when he clearly needed to clarify whether Congo and Rwanda were the same country, and clearly is utterly unaware that the 12 refugees who were shot dead in Rwanda in, I think, 2018 were actually from Congo, and that, actual war in that corner of the world is sponsored by the country into which we're sending refugees. Yeah, I mean, this is obviously territory that I'm quite familiar with, the idea that there are no consequences. But the stop the boat stuff, that is landing, is it, with your older relatives?
Absolutely. And you stand there and you go, well, hold on a minute. Since Brexit, immigration's gone up.
Yes.
And they won't have it. You say, well, hold on. Jacob Rees-Mogg and Boris told you it wasn't going to, we were going to stop immigration. Because let's be honest, that's what Brexit was about. It wasn't about...
it wouldn't have got over the line. It's why Cummings sort of held his nose a bit or pretended really to disapprove about Farage, although what Vote Leave did on Facebook in the final days of the campaign was every bit as grim as what Farage has been peddling for years. But Cummings wanted to believe that it was some sort of noble mission. They would hold their noses and get into bed with the people peddling racism or xenophobia. But I don't think it was enough to get it over the line. They kind of needed both. It was so close. Yep. They definitely needed the racists, but I think the racists needed them as well, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
Good people who thought their food would be cheaper. There you go. There's nothing wrong with that. A good person who thought their food would be cheaper. They've got nothing to be ashamed of.
And when it was pointed out, so you've had the text this morning, Project Fear, give it a rest. Just ludicrous. The facts are, I'm a caterer by trade.
Right.
My business. I've been absorbing meat price increases for the last 9 months.
Yeah.
And we're sort of sitting there going, well, we're taking bookings for 2025 now. I'm going to have to roll those increases out. I've had an email this week from my greengrocer, so I use a local greengrocer. They try and get everything they can locally and in Norfolk. We're very lucky in Norfolk.
Yes.
Have a great supply of fresh produce, but an awful lot at this time of year. All my tomatoes are still coming through Holland because the English tomatoes aren't ready yet,
sure.
or the good ones. So, I'm waiting for the price list increase there, and you just sort of hold your head in your hands, looking at ever diminishing returns, going, all of which could have been resolved.
And all of which were known and plotted and predicted. You mentioned greengrocery. My friend Andreas, who's been on the programme many times and has, as Kieran the van driver did before him, I haven't heard from Kieran for a while, I hope he's all right, that they would explain this stuff to us all the time. And they, having appeared on this programme, then got booked by other news organisations, Sky News, ITN, the BBC, because somehow the failure of the movement, the Remain movement, to get these people in front of the public was quite incredible. And that brings us back to, I think, to Cameron and Corbyn. Tim, thank you. It's a lovely part of the world, that. Near Dis. I don't know why I do this. I try to show off my knowledge of British geography sometimes. It's because I'm conscious of this sometimes being a bit of a London-centric show. But I do love Norfolk, and I do have problems with the county when it comes to Brexit. But last time what would the word be, criticised farmers for having been in support of Brexit, I got into terrible trouble with people pointing out that the people that owned the land were not necessarily farming it. The NFU might have been a little bit lily-livered, perhaps, and we associated all those signs that we saw on all that farmland with the idea that all the farmers were desperate for Brexit, and that was probably a misrepresentation. Well, definitely a bit of a misrepresentation, which I'm happy to correct. But speaking of British farmers, a couple of texts come in saying, well, it's great because now we can buy British food. Now we can buy more British food. I have to refer you to a story from yesterday's news describing the washout winter, spelling price rises for UK shoppers with key crops down by a fifth. So the impact of the weather on wheat, barley, oats and oilseed rape harvests means that you're going to see price rises on your beer, your bread, your biscuits and more, even if we weren't also introducing extra costs on the stuff that we're bringing in from other countries. So food security is a wonderful thing, and we could almost certainly benefit from having more of it. But food security is never guaranteed. So, and this again is something that Jacob Rees-Mogg has done to you. Jacob Rees-Mogg has turned you into the person this morning, trying so hard to pretend that you haven't been swindled, that you're saying, well, actually, I think you'll find that this means we can eat more British food. Well, falls to me to remind you that the UK has had the wettest 18-month period since records began in 1836. I'll say that again. The UK has had the wettest 18-month period since records began in 1836. And when it comes to climate change, what do the people who sold you Brexit and are currently trying to turn you against benefits claimants and refugees, what do they usually have to say about climate change? Same people, right? I mean, what's the opposite of a conspiracy theory? Something that's true, but is treated like a conspiracy or is completely ignored. So the people that brought you Brexit, currently trying to demonise refugees, already embarked upon a government-sponsored policy to demonise welfare claimants. The farmers can't grow the food that we need to replace the food that costs too much or costs much more to import because climate has affected the crops in the worst way since records began in 1836. But they'll be queuing up tomorrow to tell you that climate change or net zero is some sort of con as well. Quite a few of you, and I like this because it means you were paying attention back in 2016, 2017, quite a few of you asking what happened to Digby Pudding Jones, who was often wheeled out to speak in favour of Brexit from a position of almost abject ignorance. And the short answer is I don't know. And when people disappear from public life, he popped up a couple of years ago to slag off the accent of, I think it was Alex Scott, one of the sports presenters on the BBC, but I don't know, and therefore, you have to hope he's well. But I don't know what you want your formerly prominent Brexiteers to do. Do you want them to disappear from public life and stay silent? Or do you want them to take a seat in the House of Lords and do a lap of honour like Daniel Hannan? Or do you want them to carry on writing bilge for the Daily Telegraph and others? I would have thought that probably self-imposed silence was the most honourable course, up to the point where they find the courage, the conviction and the integrity to come forward and say sorry to the entire country. It's just coming up to 11:30. After the headlines, Henry Riley is on the scene in Hainault, where, as you know, 5 people have been taken to hospital and a man with a sword has been arrested after an attack in North East London. We'll get you the very latest on that live from the scene after the latest headlines with Thomas Watts. It is 11:34. I'm such an anorak. So I'm just looking at a Daily Express front page from 2016 that says cheaper food after EU exit. So I just did a little Twitter search on that. And even last year, Rees-Mogg was still claiming that we were going to have cheaper food. It's madness, isn't it? And the same man, of course, has described the measures being brought in today as a direct consequence of the Brexit he sold as an act of national self-harm. William Templeman has been in touch. He writes, every bloody week you keep banging on about it. We are out. Accept it and move on. I like messages like that, actually, because when I sit here pontificating about how we should conduct these conversations and whether or not, I love messages like that. Absolutely no chance whatsoever, William Templeman. You pooed in your hands in 2016 and you might still be clapping, but it's my job to point out to anybody unfortunate enough to encounter you in public or private life that you and your ilk are entirely responsible for all manner of messes that this country finds itself in. And today has been a show about people with the grace and intelligence to realise A, their mistake, and B, the importance of admitting it. So as long as people like you exist, I will continue having conversations like the one we've been having today. And if you'd like to contribute to it, the number you need is 0345 6060973. Breaking news earlier this morning of a critical incident in the north-east London suburb of Hainault. Henry Riley is LBC's reporter at the scene, and he joins us now. An update, if you would, Henry, and the very latest.
Well, James, good morning. A very worrying, troubling situation here in Hainault, as you mentioned, in north-east London, in the borough of Redbridge, just on the sort of cusp between Greater London and Essex. And we've had it confirmed by the London Ambulance Service that 5 people were treated at the scene with injuries and that 5 people have been taken to hospital. The Met Police earlier on saying that 2 police officers were injured as well. It's unclear as to whether they are included in those 5 who were treated at the scene. We know that a 36-year-old man has been arrested, and this happened just before 7 o'clock this morning. And there were reports of a man with a sword who went on to attack members of the public, attacked those 2 police officers that I say as well, and also reports of a sort of grey van that has been smashed up as well. Police reporting that a vehicle was driven into a house in the Thurlow Gardens area. So I'm just sort of a stone's throw away from Hainault Station. Very busy commuter station on the Central Line. Many people hoping to get into town to go to work today. That is closed, has been closed since the early hours of the morning, as is New North Road, which is where the station is located. A very busy road that connects up Hainault with various other areas as well. Now, the Met Police saying, their Deputy Assistant Commissioner, that it is a terrifying incident. They know that the wider community will face the shock and alarm. Rishi Sunak, Keir Starmer, both expressing their horror at what has happened as well. The Home Secretary, James Cleverly, saying that he is being kept abreast of developments. He's in regular touch with the Met Police, with the London Ambulance Service, as is the local MP, Wes Streeting, who's been tweeting this morning. He represents Ilford, has been explaining that he's also been in touch with the Mayor of London, with various authorities to try and get to the bottom of what happened and to really assist in any investigation. But really, James, this is an emerging picture. We know there's been that one arrest. We know there are reports of a man with a sword who was in and around this area. And I mean, people I've been speaking with in the last hour or so, clearly very concerned, clearly very worried. One man was waiting for his daughter to take her to nursery around 20 minutes ago, and obviously has decided that he would not be doing so, and he's going to stay at home instead. Very concerned, very worrying picture here.
Henry Riley, thank you. You won't know this because you were talking to me when it was announced, but the Metropolitan Police have said they're going to provide an on-camera update on this incident at 12 noon today. Meanwhile, Henry Riley, LBC's reporter at the scene in Hainault there, where 5 people have been taken to hospital and a man with a sword arrested after an apparent attack. 11:38 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. David makes a point that a lot of people make these days. I voted Brexit, James, not expecting Leave to win, but as a show of my discontent with the government. I regret that vote. And another William points out that the people telling you to move on from Brexit will be the same people moaning about interest rates being high. They may not realise that it's likely that higher prices because of Brexit will cause interest rates to stay high, or at least to come down more slowly than it otherwise would. There's also likely to be a serious impact on the housing market. I wonder whether Rees-Mogg and others will ever acknowledge this. Well, I don't think they will. And that's the bit that it still needs to be unravelled, is how, an earlier caller referred to it, how we ended up living in a country where basic competence cannot be taken for granted. Basic competence. You know, a former immigration minister who knows, for example, that Rwanda and Congo are different countries. Chief Secretary to the Treasury who understands, for example, what debt as a percentage of GDP means, what the phrase actually means, never mind what the numbers are. I can give you the numbers, I can hand you the piece of paper, but if you've got the piece of paper in front of you with the numbers on it and you claim something is falling when it's rising, we've got a problem of a magnitude that I don't think is, by any stretch of the imagination, normal. Maybe in a sort of Orwellian dictatorship where they can say freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength, war is peace. But in an apparently functioning democracy, to have senior politicians who don't understand anything and don't care when it's pointed out to them that they don't understand anything, and then in Chris Philp's case, get a red carpet invitation to the BBC One Sunday morning programme in order to pretend that you weren't being incredibly ignorant on Question Time the other night, you were asking a rhetorical question. That doesn't even make sense. But it doesn't matter, because these are the children of Brexit. It doesn't have to make sense. It doesn't have to be true. You don't have to understand anything. You won. What you won, of course, is these days impossible to describe or determine. We know what you didn't win. The list is almost endless. You didn't win border controls. You didn't win lower immigration, which you probably didn't actually want anyway, but you'd been persuaded that you did, and you certainly didn't win cheaper food, or indeed cheaper shoes, which I think got a mention at one point. Toby's in Bristol. Toby, what made you pick up the phone?
I was in Spain yesterday.
Well done.
Enjoying my freedom of movement because I'm a dual national citizen entirely due to Brexit.
Yeah,
visiting my daughter, who's enjoying her freedom of movement and the ability to study in Spain for free, and a lot of her friends who are of similar age, about 22. We were having a conversation last night with them about the food situation that was about to descend upon us. And one of the other students, who's Spanish, family owner, fruit farm, and they were just staggered in disbelief at what we've done to ourselves.
Yeah, go on.
Because what's happening is that yes, Europe is also suffering from climate-related food
of course it is.
Stress.
Of course it is.
But it's easier to sell to them, so we are back at the queue. And the other thing they just sort of laugh at us about is the fact that we can basically be charged whatever they want because we are now so desperate. And because we are back at the queue, the Spanish just charge us what they want. And I don't mean that in an anti-Spanish way.
No, I understand.
It's just they now find themselves in this ridiculous situation where they can take advantage of us because what these people have done to us.
You pay this price or you don't. And if you don't get anything, because the whole point about single markets and customs unions and freedom of movements of goods is that every customer is of equal value. But we have made ourselves a less valued customer, and therefore we will have to pay a premium. What I tell you what interests me, Toby, how surprised have you been by that? Because I got that message early doors from Chris just saying, why? If the food is the same coming in, why do we have to have checks? And it was an honest question. It was nicely phrased. It wasn't phrased in a, ha-ha, I'm really stupid, but I think I'm really clever kind of way. It was a genuine puzzlement. Why do we have to have checks when the apples or the lemons and the oranges that are coming in from Spain, the bananas that are coming in from La Gomera in the Canary Islands, whatever, it's the same suppliers and the same product coming in at the same port. Why do we now suddenly have to have checks? And I've explained on a few occasions why we have to. But I don't think many of us fully understood what the word single market meant. And I wonder, with your dual nationality now, before 2016, did you fully grasp what it meant, what it represented?
Well, I'm one of these slightly weird people that was fascinated by the EU from its inception,
right.
and when it started in 1992. I just thought, what a brilliant idea.
Yeah.
It was such a no-brainer that it made life so much easier. I remember the arguments over
Where the hell were you? Why didn't we have a whole queue of Tobys popping up every time Digby Jones turned up on the telly?
I was jumping up and down with frustration about it. And I think your earlier caller really hit the nail on the head of the utter failure of the pro-European movement to stand up for its corner, and the lack of education through our education system. I was a primary school teacher. I was actually teaching about our entry into the EU in 1992. It was my final year project when I was doing my teacher training in 1991 about our ascension into the EU. And so that sort of started that interest in my family history as, European.
What an amazing perspective you had then. As someone, I don't think it's weird to be knowledgeable, although it's certainly unfashionable. Long has been in the context of the Brexit conversation. But you must have, I don't know what the equivalent would be. I'm trying to think of an analogy. You would be sitting there knowing.
I'm the sort of the product of my parents' generation who wanted this connectivity and closer union.
Wow.
Who were both fought in the war, both served, my father in Burma and India, and my mother in the Wrens. And their absolute passion about what has happened, and not so much how the EU was structured, because obviously that's something that developed, but the idea of it as a concept. And I am the product of that, where I enjoy everything about it, but I also accept its failures and its issues, especially with the current, oncoming.
That was the weirdest bit about the conversation. As you'd say, I'm supremely confident that we're better off out than in. Better off in than out, forgive me. And someone would say, well, hang on, they're less than perfect. That proves that you're wrong. And you should go, no, of course they're less than perfect. Everybody's less than perfect. Everything is less than perfect. Nothing is perfect. But you're still better off in than out in that imperfect thing versus this considerably worse alternative.
And I will be one of those people, if we manage to get back in before I die, I'm now in my late 50s, I will be hanging the flag out. I'll be one of those weird people driving down the street, my flag out the window, because I think of the harm that these people have done to us. I've never moved on from being angry about this, because although I accept the result, because it's counting, as you quite often like to point out, I will never accept the damage these people did, and the utter ignorance that they allowed to have put upon them by these people.
And then the subsequent promotion of the people who had punted the ignorance. That was the bit I struggled with most, actually. The way that when the truth began to become clear, the people who were going to shout loudest that the truth wasn't real, that you should ignore the evidence of your eyes and ears, they were the ones that flourished. That 2019 election was the apotheosis in many ways of the ignorance and the liars taking over the whole shebang. I said, wow, was that the apotheosis, or was Liz Truss the apotheosis? I think it was the 2019 election. I'd see Liz Truss's brief tenure as Prime Minister as more symptom of this disease than cause. And the cause was people like Boris Johnson and Jacob Rees-Mogg, and specific to Brexit. Thank you, Toby. 11:47 is the time. 11:51 is the time. Crikey, it's like the good old days, isn't it? Nearly 2 hours uninterrupted on the question of Brexit, but a very, very different phone-in from the ones that we have had in the past. And we got it right today. I don't know whether it's because we found a variety of words that we haven't found before, whether the timing has shifted, whether it feels differently, whether it is the focus on the very specific question of food costs and the inarguable binary nature of the claim that they would come down by doing this thing, and then we did this thing, and as a consequence of this thing, they have gone up. That is maybe, that is the door through which so many people have felt able to pass this morning, when on previous attempts to get this angle up and running, it's often been left to people who voted to remain to speculate about the feelings and the motivations of people who voted to leave. But I like this. I derive optimism and confidence from the idea that we can all put our disagreements behind us, agree on what has subsequently become clear, and begin the very long, I suspect, process of trying to work out how to undo some of this utterly avoidable damage. 11:52 is the time. I read this from Sally. I am a left-leaning Labour Party member, and I hold Jeremy Corbyn totally responsible for Brexit. Had he endorsed Remain properly, he'd have brought millions with him. and he chose not to. Boy, did the scales fall from my eyes. Well, he did supposedly campaign for Remain, but you could be forgiven for not having noticed. And of course, refusing to share a platform with conservative Remainers was an act of petulant immaturity, really. Prioritisation of your own, I don't know what the word would be, let's try and be kind. Prioritisation of your own feelings over the actual welfare of the country, the future of the entire nation. There it is. Jonathan is in Saint-Gervais-les-Bains. Jonathan, what would you like to say?
Hi there. It's good to speak to you again, James. You mentioned earlier about the Patrick Minford effect and Emily Maitlis, and noted by many that he was basically the only economist that could ever be summoned.
What Emily did was describe how the BBC essentially pretended that the position from which he spoke was the same size and as well evidenced and as authoritative as the position from which economists opposed to Brexit spoke. That's the Minford paradigm, the false balance, the false equivalence.
Yeah, but what I feel is that most people fundamentally, including most of the Brexiters, didn't actually understand what Patrick Minford was saying anyway, or what he was arguing for, because what he wanted to do was to unilaterally drop all trade barriers. Yes. So the UK would just be a totally open market. But the result of that, which he acknowledged, would be that all farming and all industry in the UK would be utterly destroyed.
All manufacturing. He said so, didn't he? He said so to Rory Stewart in a select committee at some point. You're right.
He was fine with that, and he was, his fingerprints have been all over so much of the damage that's been done to the UK. He was Thatcher's go-to economist. So all of the mines shutting down, which is a subject close to my heart. All of the deindustrialisation of the north. That was all on him. He was fine with completely smashing up the economy in its current form and starting again. But that was never made clear by any of the Brexiters who were saying, they either didn't know. Patrick Minford.
Yeah, they either didn't know, and I think both of these constituencies exist. They either didn't know, or they didn't care, because here was someone filling the space that they needed to be filled. Here was somebody with, a tenure or some academic position who was saying what they wanted. Some of what he was saying was what they wanted to get magnified and amplified, and therefore they could ignore the rest of what he was saying, or what.
Yeah, which is such a disingenuous position, because yes, Rees-Mogg would say, Patrick Minford says that food prices will come down after Brexit,
but wouldn't say British farming will be completely British farming will be completely eradicated, or British manufacturing will cease to exist in the way that British coal mining ceased to exist last time a Prime Minister took my advice.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
You're right.
So, the dishonesty at the heart of the project is just,
and it's still there.
It's phenomenal.
It's still there. Well, just actually, in conclusion, Jonathan, because I know you've got a novel that you should be working on, not phoning up radio stations to pontificate about Brexit. What in Rees-Mogg's case in particular, do you think he was too stupid to understand or too dishonest to acknowledge the truth?
I think dishonest. I think, as you've mentioned before, his father wrote a seminal work on
the sovereign individual,
destructive economy. Yeah, effectively. Yes, Rees-Mogg would like a world where it was almost semi-feudal, and you would have the Rees-Moggs of this world with their cluster of dependent families around them, almost
like a sort of medieval model where the rich enjoyed lives of untrammeled luxury while the rest of us slept in holes. I'm probably 52-48 on that. Give it a week and I'll think he was too stupid. But yeah, that's a persuasive analysis. 11:57 is the time. Are we planning on going at 12 noon to the so not to the news? We think we'll go straight to we'll cross to the news as usual, and then reserve the right to interrupt it if the Metropolitan Police televised press conference about the situation in Hainault begins on time. Thank you, Jonathan. Back to your desk, mate. These books don't write themselves, Barry is in Alicante. It says here, Barry, Alicante via Chingford, which sounds like a sort of 1950s film, doesn't it?
I wished. We make ballroom dancing shoes.
We've spoken before.
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
And I've gone down from 4,000 pair a week to 400 pair a week. I've had to let most of my staff go. Thank God I found jobs in other shoemaking companies. And it's just really hard. And I just want to apologise to you for disagreeing with you. I should never, ever disagree with you again.
Well, don't say that, honestly. No, but we did speak a bit of this. So you were exporting 4,000 pairs of shoes a week to the EU,
yes.
I think, as one of the
to the world, the rest of the world.
The whole world.
The whole world. One of the claims to fame is we used to have a competition in the Kremlin. Would you believe?
Did you really?
They're called the Kremlin Cup. For 25 years we had that. We used to go all over Europe. And it was so much easier when
you had freedom of movement and exporting your shoes would have been so much easier as well. You don't really need to apologise. I mean, I understand your feelings, but would you let me just ask, what did you think was going to happen? Did you just, like an awful lot of people, probably myself included, we didn't really know what single market meant?
No.
Even if you're in it every day.
I've got two daughters and a wife.
Yeah.
And both of them voted to stay.
Right.
And I was the only one that, just being awkward, that's all.
But your wife is Polish, I think, if memory serves.
Yes, she's lovely, really. Yeah. And the girls are half Polish. They all speak Polish. I'm the only one that hardly makes Polish. All I can say is, ja mam imię Barry, jestem z Londynu, my żony jest Polką. That meant my name is Barry, I'm from London.
Why are you in Alicante?
Oh, I'm looking for... There's one of my machines that doesn't work anymore, and I'm looking for a second-hand one. Because over here, they got no shoe factories.
Is that right?
No one make the bloody trainers, and no one makes high heels anymore. It's a total nightmare.
Well, you live and learn, Barry. Listen, I make mistakes. Don't trust me on everything, whatever you do. But just let's keep it in the back of our minds on this one. That the people who you did trust then are unlikely to have changed their spots very much. I think that's the mad bit for me. But anyway, the time now is 12 noon. 3 minutes after 12, and you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. We are hearing that Metropolitan Police conference regarding events in Hainault earlier today could be as late as 12:30, but it does mean that we embark upon the next conversation in full knowledge that we may have to cross live and immediately to that press conference in the event of it starting. This is a bit of a different one, and I need to choose my words carefully because, well, we all change. I was actually thinking back to Barry's call a moment ago about just realising that the world has turned, the world has changed, and that you may not have changed enough with it. I think that 10 years ago, and this isn't a particular mea culpa, I think I would have covered the story we're about to cover in a slightly different way. I think I may even have covered it a bit like the male journalist covering it for the Times today has chosen to. He has written, Julia Roberts' Hollywood prostitute might not have objected, but a judge in Leicester has deemed that using the term pretty woman amounts to discrimination. Now, in other words, I would have seen it as quite a light-hearted story and possibly even a slightly silly one. How can anyone object to being called a pretty woman? I think I might have asked. And I would have pointed out my own lack of male model style attributes and would have pontificated on how much I would love to be gorgeous and therefore have it pointed out that I was gorgeous and therefore enjoy mention of how gorgeous I am or how handsome I am. And you would probably have reminded me it's very different for men and women in that context. And you may have tried to explain to me why a young woman who brought an employment tribunal case against her former employer actually had a rather serious grievance. And I still need a little bit of help in understanding the seriousness of that grievance. So let me tell you what happened. manager of a company. He inherited a business from his dad in 2015. And on the staff at the time was a young woman who they'd known for most of their adult lives. She'd been a long-standing family friend since she was 18. So that's just a little bit of context for you. But in 2021, he sent her a message regarding a planned meeting, a business meeting with a customer, a client. And he wrote, "You should come as," and I'm going to say Joe Bloggs, all right? "You should come as Joe Bloggs is attending and he likes pretty women." Just pause there. Let that settle. Just let that settle. What? I mean, almost tempted now at 6 minutes after 12 to say, what do you think about that? We've got a business meeting. Joe Bloggs is coming. Can you come too? He likes pretty women. The more I let that settle, the more I understand the grievance, actually, and the more I realise how ridiculous it would be for me to sit there complaining about not being not being especially handsome. I'm all right, but I'm definitely not the best looking bloke. I'm probably the best looking bloke in this room, but I'm the only one in it. So what I mean is I'm already doing it. Do you see? Did you catch that? So I just did it. This is so weird, this sort of psychological conditioning. So I've established that it's serious. I've made you stare at the seriousness, and then I started being lighthearted about it again straight away. And that is a mistake, I think. You may want to ring in and tell me that it's not a mistake at all. And he then made it worse, telling her to calm down and signing off that message with "Okay, babes, kiss, kiss." And the young woman concerned resigned later that month and sued for sex discrimination and harassment. Many of her claims were dismissed, but this complaint about the pretty woman remark was upheld by the employment tribunal judge. And I want to do two things. I want you to tell me what it's like. Well, first of all, I want you to tell me about the time that you were essentially treated by a senior colleague, by a manager, by an employer, based on your looks. So, you might be the best accountant in the building, but he said, "We need you to come to the meeting with Acme Incorporated because because he likes pretty women." Or he might have said, "Wear a short skirt," or something like that. I mean, I grew up in the era of Carry On films and Benny Hill. So it took me a long time to see why that kind of behaviour is completely unacceptable. Even as, and this was the mad bit, even as women would ring me when we touched on topics like this in the past, perhaps in slightly more obvious ways, like wolf whistling or that kind of thing. But women would ring me, particularly women of a certain age. It's not long after I started here, which is 20 years ago. But women would ring me and tell me that they liked the behaviours that young women were complaining about. So older women would ring me and say, "I used to like getting my bottom pinched at work because I took it as a compliment." And I felt, in a very clumsy, privately educated at an all-boys school kind of way, I felt very awkward trying to tell them that they were wrong to feel that way, because that felt like mansplaining or even patronising. And yet, when I come across a story like this, two things happen. I do fully understand why this is unacceptable behaviour, undesirable up to unacceptable, but I still have that slightly clumsy and I suspect exclusively male response. Well, it's not exclusively male, actually, because I discussed it with a female colleague earlier today, and we both knew that we shouldn't be saying, "How can you complain about the fact that someone thinks you're pretty?" But there is a little subtext in your brain where you're thinking, how can you complain about the fact that if someone said you can't come to this meeting because you're a minger, is that still a thing? People still use that word? You can't come, don't want you coming, you're a right old ming. It would be the same, wouldn't it? So here's a slightly lecherous man, okay, but we need his business. You can't come because you're not very pretty. You can come because you are. Now, no one would say, I don't think, no one would ring me up now to say, "Oh, that's fine. If she's a minger, she can't. If he's a minger, he can't go to that." But this is the opposite of that. Saying you must come because you're pretty. So she responded to the original invitation by saying that she wouldn't come if she was just going to be attending in the capacity of being a pretty face. She responded literally by saying, I'm not coming if just for pretty face. And I think this is a much more serious story than the Times introduction allows. I think it is. I think it's inappropriately irreverent to write about Julia Roberts' Hollywood prostitute might not have objected, but a judge in Leicester has deemed that using the term pretty woman amounts to discrimination. I mean, just to be a little bit pedantic, that the entire film is about not judging a book by its cover. So despite the fact that it's called Pretty Woman, the entire film is about not judging a book by its cover or not taking things at face value or recognising that people's skills and attributes are a heck of a lot more than skin deep. So it's an infelicitous film to cite in the first place, but you understand why they've done it because the words Pretty Woman appeared in the offending text, and of course that is the name of the film, not to mention the Roy Orbison song of the same name. So I just want you to tell me two things. I want you to tell me what happened to you. It's not a compliment. It's not saying that's a lovely dress or you look nice today. It is saying I want you to come to this meeting because the customer likes pretty women. So something similar that's happened to you at work, all right? 0345 6060 973. And then I do want a little bit of help in articulating, not understanding, because I think I understand it, and I think part of my understanding of it is the parallel with telling an employee not to come to a meeting because they're not physically attractive. You've got no trouble getting your head around why that's inappropriate. But I want a little bit of help in articulating why it is so hurtful, why it is so offensive. Because it is, on one level, a compliment. Do you see what I mean? You do see what I mean. I'm not tying myself in privately educated all-boys school-shaped knots on this, am I? It is a compliment to say that you're pretty. You might not even want to hear it because, you know, there's some sleazy old git sitting in the corner rubbing his thighs telling you you're pretty. But it's still objectively complimentary to say someone is nice looking. And yet to say it in this way is not only wrong, but also it constitutes sexual discrimination. 03 for well, partly because he would never say that to a man. So I want to know what happened to you, but I also want you to do a better job than me of explaining why well, of course you can have a go at explaining why the Employment Tribunal judge has got it wrong if you want on 0345 6060 973. You really can. I mean, you may think I'm overreacting, but I don't want to hear from men that are older than me on the subject of why this woman should just wind her neck in and be grateful for the compliment, all right? No offence, but that is not a helpful conversation. What I want to do is hear from women who ideally are younger than me and recognise how inappropriate this behaviour is, but can do a slightly better job than I've currently managed in articulating it. All right? It's coming up to 12:15. Nick's been in touch already. I come from the catering industry. Beautiful people sell. It shouldn't be like that, but it is. I don't see it changing either. I'm not going to argue with that or pick you up on that, but it's saying it out loud to the beautiful person that is unacceptable. And also, you know, it depends slightly on what sort of business it is. It's a vehicle recovery firm. Literally, they send out tow trucks. So it's not like you're selling Chanel No. 5, but the point where you say you should come to this meeting because you're pretty. It's got nothing to do with your attributes, your acumen, your skills, your professional experience, your qualities. I want you in this meeting because you're pretty. Can you do a better job than me of explaining why that employer is bang out of order and how that young woman felt? And the reason why you can do a better job than me is because it's happened to you. It's 12:15. 18 minutes after 12 is the time. Laura says, imagine being sent to a meeting to be leched over. You should feel safe at work. A couple of people wondering whether it would be different for a man. You know, I don't know whether the customer would be a woman or a gay man, but you'd say he likes handsome young men or she likes handsome young men. Why don't you come to the meeting? It's 10 to 1,000 times less likely to happen. And Liz writes, I felt flattered in one way, But when men made those remarks in front of everyone else around them, I would get a lot of jealousy from my female colleagues, which was very upsetting to me. So I told you it was nuanced. But I don't think there's much dispute about, well, maybe there is. Let's find out. Emily's in Reading. Emily, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello.
Nice to speak to you.
Likewise.
So I don't think you're tying yourself in knots about this subject. I think it is a really, really difficult one, and I don't want to offend any woman who's been put in a situation where she didn't feel safe or didn't feel valued at work. However, my own personal experience is also quite conflicted. As a 20 or 30-year-old woman in technology sales, I would often be in situations which I knew were slightly wrong, or be put in situations where people would say things and I knew full well that they were wrong morally. I had a presentation once when I was, I think, about 27, and a guy interrupted me and said he couldn't concentrate on my presentation, which was a very big presentation that I was making to try and win a deal at the time with a client. He couldn't concentrate because all he could think about was taking me out to dinner.
Was he the client?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I remember thinking, oh God, I have two choices in this moment: become a complete bitch.
Yes.
And
you mean bite his head? I don't know that Ofcom it looks any more favourably on people spelling out swear words than it does on them saying.
Sorry.
That's okay. But you mean biting his head off in public and in front of other people?
Yeah, biting his head off in front of other people, or taking it away and dealing with it more personally, which I did with my boss at the time. That was just one experience. There were many other experiences where I was taken to meetings like, oh, so-and-so likes pretty women, you'll get on with him. But there was an undertone of, this is why you're being brought here. Now, I decided to not become the victim in those situations. That's not to say that you shouldn't, and you shouldn't think that those well, it
also depends on how you actually felt, because two women in an identical situation are not going to have an identical reaction. They're not going to have a similar level of grit. If you felt very, very upset by it, you would have responded differently from how you would respond if you felt mildly upset by it or irritated by it.
I didn't feel very, very upset by it.
I sense that.
Okay, it's a compliment. This guy's an idiot, and I'm going to choose to win the deal by exploiting that.
Yes, okay.
And I think that's a choice that, unfortunately, only women will understand.
I think you're right. And it's slightly different when it's the customer rather than your employer. And, if your employer had said, he's going to ask you out for dinner, would you go? Then we'd be having a whole different order of conversation about that, because that would be a sort of form of restaurant-based pimping almost, wouldn't it? And no one would dispute the inappropriateness of that. But some people have got the gift of the gab. Some people have got other gifts, more physically obvious gifts, and we all use what gifts we've got sometimes in pursuit of what we want, I suppose.
Yeah, and it does happen. That doesn't make it right. It does happen a lot.
For sure.
But now I find myself, a 42-year-old mum of two, and if I was in a meeting where someone said I can't concentrate because you're so beautiful, I'd be like, oh, great.
Well, no, don't. You see, you've done it now, because that's what women used to say to me about being wolf whistled, is that we'd be explaining how it feels like harassment, and they're doing it to schoolgirls, and the only way you can stop builders from behaving in this way is by telling them that it's utterly unacceptable. And then someone like you would ring in and say, I wish I still got wolf whistled, James. I miss those days.
But therein lies the conflict, right? If that happened to my daughter now, I would say to her, absolutely, that is wrong. I would fight to the death for her. But for me, that's where the nuance lies.
And that is exactly why we are having this conversation. And that's why you need employment tribunals. Sometimes you need someone, hopefully with the wisdom of Solomon, to sit in judgment on these things. Emily, thank you. Vicky's been in touch saying, being pretty means you are demeaned by men and there's jealousy from other women. You literally can't win. Now, again, I remember taking the mickey from or out of a story a while ago I think someone wrote an article for the Daily Mail about how hard it is being beautiful. No one understands the burdens we bear, the crosses we bear. And I may even have fallen into the trap of saying, you're not that beautiful, mate. I don't know why you're the one writing this article. But Vicky's obviously got a point there, that the idea that you are in a workplace and, being really good looking might actually help open some doors or land some deals. But to be judged exclusively on how you look, to be told you're just going to this meeting because he likes looking at you, that's incredibly demeaning. And I think the word Emily used several times was nuanced, and I don't think anyone can argue with that. Ash is in Ipswich. Ash, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello,
Thanks for having me on.
You're very welcome.
I have worked throughout catering and hospitality. That's my background.
Yeah.
And I've had several times, if there's a difficult customer, I've been told by managers, oh, you go and deal with it. You've got a pretty face. You can diffuse the situation.
Right.
And I think...
What sort of situation?
Where a customer is complaining or a customer is probably had a bit too much to drink, which then can become very escalated.
Yes.
So I think from my point of view, I would say I was put deliberately in a difficult situation, perhaps because of the way, because the way I look. And I feel like that is very demeaning, as your last texter said, basically.
But surely you've got other skill. I mean, you can't just go and stand in front of an angry customer and look pretty. I mean, you've got to be bringing something else to that scenario.
I can have a bit of chat, but it would be, sort of, oh, well, you go and deal with it.
And you knew that it was because you were the pretty one on duty that day.
Yeah, definitely. And they've said it openly and clearly. You're the one with the pretty face. You go and deal with it. They'll be all right with you. And I just think it is demeaning, and I think there's a time and a place for compliments and for delivering those, as the same as what you were talking about with wolf whistling in the street. There's a time and a place, and I just think if you're bringing that into someone's characteristics in a role, it is demeaning. I mean, obviously, there are some advantages as you've talked about. But I think
that's it, though, isn't it? Because you might, you could say, all right, don't accept those advantages if you don't like the disadvantages. You're like this. Angela in Greenwich sent me this. She says, I'm a woman of a certain age, James, and we were socially conditioned to enjoy the attention, good or bad, of men. I'm so happy that this is increasingly not the case. It's really generational, this, I think. It really is.
Massive. It is massive. And, I mean, a lot of when I was younger, I worked in a golf club, and the average age of the members will say is quite high.
Yes.
And it was very much, customers and I've had my bum pinched walking past people, things like that.
Yes.
And it is generational. It's like, oh, that's okay, just having a laugh. And I just think there needs to be some sort of balance now.
And Emily's saying that, even though she recognises her own sort of, hypocrisy is too strong a word, in missing elements of that power that you have as a beautiful woman, if anyone spoke to her daughter in that way or objectified her daughter in that way, she'd have a big problem with it. So we're complicated creatures, Ash. That's all, isn't it? We're complicated creatures, but we know that particularly bottom pinching is antediluvian. That's behaviour from a different age. I bet it still goes on. I'm sure it still goes on. But you wouldn't, I hope, have your own employer telling you that it's something that you just have to put up with anymore, or that's what he's like, or just keep quiet and enjoy the big tip that you'll get later in the day. Thank you. 12:27 is the time. Hannah is in Southend-on-Sea. Hannah, what would you like to say?
Oh, hello, James.
Hello.
I'm a long-time listener, first-time caller, so a little bit nervous. But, I just thought my experience might be relevant because I was working for a large company that's a household name.
Oh, yeah.
And my manager at the time would routinely use my physical attributes as a reason to send me to angry customers. So if there was an angry customer that was complaining about something, I was told to go and flutter, even in emails, I got you to flutter your eyelids at this one.
Really?
And it was almost like if there's an angry male customer, they sent me.
That's quite dangerous as well, isn't it? I mean,
and
Sorry.
Yeah, the position was... Sorry, Jan. No, the position was the line of work was to do with renting cars.
Right.
So I would be in a car with an angry male customer by myself. So my manager was routinely putting me in this position, and it got to a stage then when one customer then asked the way to calm him down would be to look at my breasts.
Oh, my days. I'm so sorry.
And, you know, it's fine because, you know, every experience builds character and strength, doesn't it? And
I hope so.
I feel like, you know, for me, it was like a safety risk there.
Yes.
And I did end up leaving because I wasn't satisfied with how it was dealt with. And we did go to tribunal. And the only reason we didn't go public with it was because of my age at the time, and my parents wanted to kind of protect me with that.
But you were successful in the tribunal, were you?
Yes. But
and
not
that was sexual discrimination.
were-
Sexual discrimination.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. But I wouldn't be confident that practices have changed. And there was a lot of, you know, it was a really traumatic time. The company were very aggressive in their approach to dealing with it. But it was, you know, absolutely...
Trying to make you go
sexual
away almost. Trying to make the
and-
problem disappear.
Yeah, lots of gaslighting and things like that. And I think just the reason why I phoned in was I think the line, because, you know, I also agree with the opinion that if someone thinks that I'm attractive, that I do find that to be a compliment.
Of course.
So
would I, Hannah, if it ever happened to me.
I'll take that anytime.
Yes.
But I think the line is when it's coming from, you're directed from a person that's in authority, so you're not consenting to it. So like when you were saying about whether you have the gift of the gab or different gifts, that is your gift and it's your consent as to how and when you choose to use those gifts that you perceive to have. But it's when you're not in control, you're being directed by someone in authority to do something that is not safe or you're not comfortable with or you don't consent to. I think that is the line where employers have to be showing that they are safeguarding their employees from that, you know. And
he'd literally say to you, go and flirt with this fella because he's really cross. That's just gross, isn't it? And I don't know, actually, I don't want to fall into another trap of my own digging, but there's part of me that wonders whether he has daughters and how he'd feel if someone spoke to them like that, you know? Sending you out as a sort of, I don't know, as a undercover pretty woman. It's ridiculous.
Yeah,
and you were very young.
I
think you were very young, which makes everything worse.
Yeah. So trying to deal with that, and when I did voice my concerns and how unfair I felt it was. Yeah. We were washing cars one night, and he then jet washed me. Like it got quite nasty to because they didn't really want me to create
problems for them.
Or highlight the practices that were happening in his branch.
It's just a bit of fun. It's just a bit of fun. It's just banter.
Yeah, and it was his mismanagement why the customers were angry in the first place, and he didn't like someone really.
No. You learned, like you said, you learned a lot from that, and I'm sorry that you had to, but it really helped me come to a much better understanding of the whole issue, and I hope your subsequent employment experiences have been. I sense they probably have been much happier. Thank you, Hannah. Take care. The time is 12:32. We'll cross to Amelia Cox for the headlines, but there is a chance that Metropolitan Police Conference will start, in which case we will cross immediately to that live. It's 12:32. 12:35 is the time. We are expecting a live Metropolitan Police Conference regarding events in Hainault earlier today. And, of course, as is often the case on days like this, there's no absolute cast iron schedule, no guarantee of when precisely it will begin. And we are completely live. Ergo, we continue this conversation and remind you that we may have to curtail it quite abruptly in order to cross live to that Metropolitan Police Conference. In the meantime, you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we are discussing the surprisingly nuanced case of a young woman who was told to attend a business meeting because the client in the meeting likes pretty women or likes pretty faces, and there is clearly a line over which that employer stepped. That at least was the finding of the Employment Tribunal judge. And yet plotting that line depends upon quite a lot of variables, not all of which are immediately obvious. Just in case you wondered why I said I worried that I was setting a trap for myself when I found myself wondering what Hannah's former manager would have thought about someone treating his daughters in the way that he treated her. Emma has helped me, actually, not for the first time, understand my own feelings that I couldn't necessarily articulate when they write, it is a trap. Women shouldn't have to, quotes, belong, end quotes, to a man to warrant humane treatment. Mother, wife, daughter, girlfriend, they're all relations to men. And if someone has to think of them in those terms to have that basic human empathy, then it shows somewhat of a misogynist disconnect, even if subconscious. Such is my character. I'm now tempted to defend myself by saying, no. I was thinking it might help him, the misogynist, realise how out of order he was. I wasn't suggesting that but that's splitting hairs, isn't it? Because I said, well, what would he think if it was his own daughter? So I'm saying he would only be able to appreciate how inappropriate he was behaving if he imagined someone behaving that way towards his daughter. Thank you, Emma, as always. Sally's in Stourbridge. Sally, what made you pick up the phone?
Hello, James.
Hello, Sally.
Because it just brought back terrible memories that I couldn't believe actually happened to me. And as I haven't got much time, I'm going to go straight to the nub of it.
Carry on.
I was in an interview where the interviewer suggested that the way I dressed was in order to ingratiate myself with the client.
Gosh.
Bearing in mind I was just wearing an ordinary black skirt and a green shirt, and I was trendy but professional. He then went on to say, do I always wear hoop earrings? Because that, of course, my clients would like. I don't go into details, but there is a reason for that.
Okay.
And then he said afterwards, I heard about it afterwards, to my boss, who was on the interviewing panel, and a formidable feminist, no wonder she doesn't have any problems getting her own way with the head teachers looking the way she does.
It's just rude as well as inappropriate.
I know, and I was so upset. I can't tell you how upset I was, James, but mainly because she didn't stand up for me. That I made a complaint to HR.
Sorry to interrupt, but that's what other people have meant by the envy, perhaps the jealousy. So you don't actually, you say ardent feminist, but that was the opposite of feminism.
Well, everyone had a crush on this guy. He was attractive. He was powerful, and he used his position. I complained. HR sent him on a course, a sort of sexual awareness course, and he and another guy behaved so badly on this course. But she said there was absolutely nothing she could do with them, and there was nothing she could do about it either.
No, I guess things have changed, but that was a long time ago, and it stayed with you.
It was a long time ago. Oh, my God, yes, it just came flooding back. The next day I felt like going to work with a bag over my head.
But you didn't.
I didn't know, but I felt as though I really felt as though it was an attack on me personally that I didn't behave professionally.
But do you know what? Yeah, but there's the other thing there as well, which has been missing from this conversation, is that if you were good at that element of your job that you just described, then they're actually diminishing your talents and your efforts by saying, oh, it's all just because of the way she looks. It's got nothing to do with the fact that she's, worked hard at this or done that or has empathy or understands this or is very good at people skills or is very good at dealing with difficult clients. It's all just because she's wearing a black skirt and has got a pretty face.
That's exactly what it was. I was used to getting attention, but never in my professional life. People behaved professionally. And the thought that maybe it wasn't because I was so good at my job.
Yeah, no, and that's blatant discrimination, and there's no real way that they'd ever speak to a man like that. Sally, thank you. I'm sorry for your trouble. I'm sorry to have brought it back into your memory this morning, but if we look for some optimism from this whole scenario, it would probably be that things have got better. There's still time for more calls on this. 0345 606 0973. I've got the Met Police news conference starting imminently regarding the apparent attack in Hainault earlier today. Police due to give an update on the 5 people injured in East London in what is being described as a sword attack. So do bear in mind that may kick in mid-conversation. So I had a little wince there because we've got a bloke on the line. Phil's in St Helens. Phil, what made you pick up the phone on this particular topic?
Hi, James. It was just on the basis that there was a couple of things that happened in the past that I'd never really batted an eyelid about previously until you raised this today. So I worked in financial services, or still do, but worked in financial services for years, and it wasn't uncommon for me to be told to come to this meeting because this client, she likes a smart young man. He never batted an eyelid. It was just, I suppose, businesses pandering to the discriminations of clients and you doing what you needed to do to get the job done. I wouldn't say it's had a lasting effect on me, but it's worked in the opposite direction as well.
You don't live in a world where you are under the constant threat of sexual violence, do you?
Oh, no, completely agree. And I'm not saying, I'm not agreeing, I'm not downplaying
you kind of
or
are.
anything like that. I no,
you can't. I think you are. I'm just going to consult with a female colleague. Okay, no.
I'm really not downplaying it. I'm kind of saying that I've never really considered it in that way until it was explained by you today.
Fair enough. Do you know what the other thing is, Phil? Bizarrely, when Vicky and others got in touch to say men demean us and women are jealous, I'm now jealous of you. So that's proving it from. So I'm now thinking, I wish someone had said to me, you should. It's often been observed, Phil, that I have a face for radio, which is not a very nice or kind thing to say. But I'm now thinking, I wish I was the kind of bloke that people said you should come along to this meeting because they really like good-looking men. And yet,
it was not good-looking, smartly dressed.
Well, that's never going
to.
Well, I might have got that in my menswear days, but we were all smartly dressed when I worked in Aquascooter.
Sartorial elegance.
Yes. Well, that's slightly different because that's. Hang on, don't interrupt me when I'm interrupting you. You can't be objectified over your clothes, really, can you?
No, smart young man. So if I was an older man, would I have been asked to go? I don't know.
Okay.
But on the flip side of that, and again, not really thought about it until today in detail, there's been times where I've been asked not to go to meetings because I was too young and the client wouldn't pay attention.
Yeah.
Or I didn't have the right accent. So
okay. Yeah, accent is interesting.
Discrimination is discrimination at the end of the day, isn't it?
Yeah, there is. An accent would definitely be on my list of things that we should be more careful about, more aware of. Age is trickier. I mean, depending on financial services, you've got the same qualifications as an older colleague, but not the same amount of experience. So you want someone a bit more experienced in the room as opposed to someone a bit older. So more nuance, actually. And How glad I am that I deferred to a female colleague there before taking a swing at Phil, because his point was valid. I'm going to take a little break now, but again with the reminder that we may interrupt it to cross live to this Metropolitan Police News Conference. It is 12:47 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. We're not doing accents today, but we will. It is one of my all-time favourites. This text of reminding us, or rather telling us, that the British Army still actively discriminates against regional accents when it comes to officer selection. But the experience of women in the context of discrimination is going to be different from the experience of men for a variety of reasons. But I think you're quite right to remind me not to diminish or dismiss the male experience. Sam's been in touch. So I've just started a new contract gardening at a care home, and one of the elderly women there has started calling me Crumpet. And now all the female carers have joined in. And I don't know what to say, and it's a bit awkward. If I was a woman, I feel I'd be able to raise it as harassment, but as a male, what can I do? other than feel awkward. And yeah, I think that is actually a valid point. And what I found most interesting about that and the previous caller was my own subscription to the jealousy thing. So you get a message off a beautiful woman saying, oh, it's terrible, men demeanours and women are jealous. And you think, yeah, get over yourself. And then a bloke writes in and says, everyone calls me Crumpet. And you think, oh, I wish someone had called me Crumpet. And that makes you more likely to dismiss his feelings. Say, well, don't be ridiculous. It's great to be, but it's not. If it makes you uncomfortable, it makes you uncomfortable. And I see why it makes you uncomfortable. 12:49 is the time. Jill's in Crewkerne in Somerset. Jill, what would you like to say?
Oh, hello, James.
Hello.
Yes, I worked with a colleague who was actually a young, pretty Asian girl.
Yes.
And it was in a management training environment. And a male colleague from the tutoring staff started coming to lunch with our team. And it was pretty obvious that it was because she was there and she was studying, so he was going to help her with her dissertation and she could come down to his house and study with him. And the rest of the team were very protective of her, especially because she was so young. And we were like, no, you're not going anywhere. If you go there, one of us will come with you.
Gosh.
And it's the feeling that women are going to be jealous of other women being pretty. It's not actually the case. Sometimes it brings out the caring part of other women, and they don't want to see another woman discriminated and put into a predatory situation. It's not comfortable for other women to witness this. So it highlights the whole, it puts attention within an entire department, which isn't jealousy, it's protectiveness.
No, of course.
And you want to be concentrating on your job. You don't want to be thinking, I've got to make sure that this female colleague is safe because there's somebody trying to be predatory with her.
Yes. And I mean, that's the dial gets turned up there all the way to predatory, as you described. But the original offence that started this conversation was simply a request to someone to attend a meeting because the customer client liked pretty women. I mean, no suggestion that anything more than that would take place or that anyone was behaving in a predatory fashion. But the discomfort that would introduce is a little bit easier to understand, I think, in 2024 than it was 10 or 20 or more years ago.
Well, it implies consent to someone being sexually predatory.
Yes.
That's the bit that gets me, is you're saying that behaviour is okay, therefore the next step is, can be uncomfortable, then it can turn into sexual, then it can turn into being predatory. So it all starts with something little.
Yeah, no, you're right, and that. I mean, yeah, but then someone will push back saying that I've been in situations where I have consciously used my leverage when that leverage has included physical charms. Thank you, Jill. I got I just checked this one out because I thought when I said it that it might be problematic, but when I said you can't be objectified over your clothes, what I meant was that a man saying they want a smart young person at the thing is obviously can be objectified over short skirts and low cut tops and things like that. I've lost the one that I wanted to read out. I think it was from Debbie. It was a lovely message that arrived while I was feeling sorry for myself for not being George Clooney, and it just said, here it is. Thank you, Deborah. It said, while at your book signing in Manchester, James, I told you that I was in danger of becoming a groupie. I only found out the following day the true meaning of the word and have been mortified ever since. This is my chance to apologise. Thank you, Deborah. There is absolutely no need to apologise, but we cross live now, I think, to the Hainault in East London, where Chief Superintendent Stuart Bell is giving an update on this morning's incident.
This morning. It is a prepared statement, and afterwards I won't be taking any questions, and if I do, I'll be referring back to the information in the statement, purely because this is a very fast-moving incident, and we will, of course, share as much information as we can when we get the detail and we can share it. You will be aware that a serious incident occurred here at this location this morning. Police and ambulance services were called and deployed to a number of casualties. It is with great sadness that I confirm that one of those injured in the incident, a 13-year-old boy, has died from their injuries. He was taken to hospital after being stabbed and sadly died a short while after. The child's family are being supported firstly by my local officers and now with some specialist officers, and and everyone across the Met is keeping them in our thoughts at this unimaginably difficult time. The events of this morning are truly horrific, and I cannot even begin to imagine how those affected must be feeling. My thoughts are with the injured, their families and the wider community as we all begin to come to terms with what has happened and try to understand what has happened here. I know that there will be, clearly and understandably, a desire for answers and an explanation as to what happened. Our investigation is in its very early stages, and my officers are working right now to establish the full facts as a priority, and we will share what we can when we can with the wider community and, of course, with yourselves. A 36-year-old is currently in custody. He was tasered here at the scene and arrested 22 minutes after the first call was made to police shortly before 7 a.m. this morning. I want to confirm at present that we do not believe there is any ongoing threat to the wider public, and we're not seeking any other persons. The incident does not appear to be linked to any act of terrorism. We know now that during the incident 5 people were injured, 3 members of the public and 2 of my local officers who were responding to the call. 2 of those members of the public remain in hospital. Thankfully, their injuries are not believed to be life-threatening. The 2 Met police officers are also currently in hospital with stab wounds. Both require surgery and have significant injuries, but we believe at this stage that they were not life-threatening. I commend the incredible bravery of not just the police officers but the other emergency responders who came to this scene this morning. I would ask anyone with information or any footage that would help us with this investigation to share that and call 101, please. I know the families of those involved, the local and wider community, and many across London will want to know why this terrible incident occurred. And it's our job to find that out, and we will. I am committed to providing those answers when we can, and I would ask for some patience while this important work is carried out. Thank you for your time.
Mr. Bell, was the man arrested yesterday?
The male was arrested this morning at the scene.
Was he previously arrested?
I'm not going to be commenting on any of those questions other than the information that I've released. We will share that information when we feel it's appropriate and when we know the answers. Okay.
Was the suspect known to the police, sir? Was the suspect known to the police
So
previously?
we do not believe this to be a targeted attack, and we are establishing the circumstances at the moment.
And
Okay,
was the
thank you.
suspect known to the police, sir?
No further questions, I'm afraid. Thank you.
Chief Superintendent Stuart Bell there giving an update on that incident in Hainault early today and confirming, or revealing actually, that a 13-year-old boy had died in what has been described as a sword attack, 4 others injured, and details of those injuries contained within that statement. Time it's just gone 12:57. 2 Met police officers as well requiring surgery, but the death of a 13-year-old boy in a residential area in north-east London just being confirmed there by the Chief Superintendent. Crikey, what an absolutely terrible story. I don't think in the circumstances we will be going back to any calls, any waiting calls on the vexed and fascinating topic with which we've been concerning ourselves over the last hour. But I'm certainly looking at the coverage of this case in Hainault and finding myself confident that there are going to be more details and more information released in the course of today, indeed of this afternoon, all of which we will, as ever, bring straight to your attention on LBC. I suppose a quick look back over the programme, and it was back to Brexit territory that we found ourselves travelling at 10 o'clock this morning, perhaps inevitably, but gratifyingly, I think we managed to find at least some common ground, and that, I hope, sets the tone for conversations in the future, because I'll tell you something for nothing, and that is that it's not going away, however much you may want it to. The actual measurable, real consequences of voting to become the first population in the history of humanity to impose economic sanctions on itself is going to be a generation-defining story. It is almost going to be the polar opposite of what happened post 1976. In that, on this occasion, the people keeping the story, keeping the flames alive, will be the ones telling the truth, not the ones peddling the xenophobic lies. But anyway, if you missed that or any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, the official LBC app, where you can also pause and rewind live radio. Download it now for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Coming up at 4 on LBC, it's Tom Swarbrick, but now it's time for Sheila Fogarty. 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 Now